Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today I'm going to be giving you the summary of the Sun and Moon to Team Up format. It's been, a real big, impactful set. The birth of Tag Team GX Pokemon really bringing about a big shift in the TCG. It has a bunch of regionals, a bunch of special events, as well as 2 internationals. So there was a real long period where this format was all we had, and there's been a real progression from the very beginning, starting at Oceania and then sort of ending towards the EUIC, as well as a couple of regionals on the tail end of that as well. So it's going to be interesting to see, seeing as though we've just kicked off with Unbroken Bonds, it always makes me think like how we react to Japanese results, how that affects our initial tournaments, and then how we start to see shifts in the metagame as it progresses on to the late stages. So always lessons to be learned here looking at these previous formats, and it can help direct us in terms of how we can look towards decks going into Unbroken Bonds. So let's have a quick look at the tournaments that are in this format. As you can see, kicks off with Oceania, and then we have a bunch of SBEs, regionals. The ones highlighted in red are sub 100 player events, so I'm actually not going to be talking about them in detail at all. Just letting you know that there was a huge amount of SPEs and regionals in this format, so a lot of points on offer. So if you had nailed a deck for this sort of few month period, you're going to be getting a lot of points under your belt. So that's really awesome. UIC sort of rounds things out, as well as Bristol and Malaysia regionals. So let's kick off with the pre-team up release and where people's heads were at. As you can see, the Champions League in Niigata was the only real tournament that we had to base off of. And this whole tournament, although it was over 1,000 players, it actually didn't have the team-up stuff. It was only up to Ultra Shiny. So they had stuff like Zapdos and Jirachi, but they didn't actually have any of the tag team Pokemon. So we actually had no sort of like prior knowledge going into the AUIC outside of just sleeving up proxies, getting testing, and then it all comes out online, and we have like a couple weeks, and then suddenly it's the AUIC, and you've got to have your deck list ready. So a few keynotes from this tournament. Obviously, Zapdos got 3rd place, as well as a couple other placements in top 8. So Zapdos was definitely kind of like on the radar, but there was always that question mark of like, yes, it's good, but its damage output is so limited, but can it compete with tag teams? That's kind of like the question mark that was first posed to Zapdos, saying like, sure, this damage is fast and powerful, and you can Grinch down stuff, but can you actually deal with big 3 prize Pokemon like Pikarom? And as you can see from like initial reactions of people, it felt like most people were on the Pikarom hype train. Zoroark up there as well. Ultra Malamar being very hyped. These are the 2 decks that made the finals, by the way. And then there's a lot of hype for Lost March. Again, a few things from Team Up that a lot of people thought was the sort of rebirth of that archetype. And you can see down here, Zapdos Jolteon was probably the most hyped build going into this Team Up meta. Obviously, it made 5th place here and a couple of other placements later down the line, but it feels like the Zapdos Shrine deck, the one that we saw get 3rd, wasn't all that hyped. It was, below a bunch of other more questionable decks now that you look at it. So it's a nice little indication here that people aren't always right from the outset, and the meta does develop quite a lot. We also saw a really awesome build from Shintaro Ito with his Swampert Meganium Greninja deck. That never really transferred over. This was like an anti-meta deck for the Ultra Shiny set, and when tag teams came out, it pretty much obliterated the chances of this stage 2 anti-meta deck working, because obviously Tag Bolt can just knock out like a Meganium and a Swampert or something on the same turn, and then everything goes to pot. So there you go. Quick note on my top 10 decks before the AUIC from my testing. I still had Zoroark being very consistent and strong. Obviously, it gained some cards like Pokecom and whatnot, which is really good for the deck. Also, a few other pieces here and there. The new Lycanroc as well was arguably very strong. And just the fact that you had a draw engine as well as fighting types added into the deck made me think its Pikarom was relatively close. Pikarom, obviously the hype deck, I only put at 2nd. Mali was one that I was really hyped on. I thought that the GX attack of Ultra Necrozma was so strong against the likes of Zapdos Lost March, which was being hyped pre-tournament, so it made me think that Malamar was in a better place. Also, having an answer to the likes of Celasaur and Pikarom, the fact that you can literally just one-shot them if you get enough Malis out was very appealing. Lost March was super hyped, and I kind of fell for the hype a little bit, put it in at 4th. It transpired that, a lot more Zapdos did well, and that's one of the worst matchups for Lost March, and Malamar continued to be like a threat the entire time. Lost March was one of those decks that had like a pretty favorable Zoro matchup as long as Muck wasn't too detrimental to you. Bear in mind, this was at a time when Muck wasn't like always a staple in Zoroark. It was basically a tech card for Gramble at the time, and now it's kind of like all changed now that Jirachi is like a factor. So Lost March was a lot less like volatile back then. It was kind of kept in check by like Decidueye and other stuff like that outside of its own inconsistencies. So a lot of people thought that like the dawn of Pokecom plus Emolga kind of changed Lost March to the point where it was insane. Zapdos variants I only put at 6th, which is a surprise to myself looking back at it now, but you can see also on the list I had stuff like Jolteon Greninja, so I was obviously conscious of having counters to it. I also had Passimian Coco on the list, so as much as I was like putting Zapdos low down, I had decks on here to be like, well, this can answer Zapdos, this can answer Zapdos. Quackdag, this can answer Zapdos. So maybe it was more of a question like I was expecting the Malamar matchup to be more favorable against Zapdos than it actually turned out to be. So that's probably why I didn't put it quite as high as I perhaps should have. And obviously later down the line you'll see that Zapdos is clearly, you know, one of the top 3 decks, as we all know at this point. But yeah, pretty interesting to see where people's minds were at the beginning of the AUIC and how that changes pretty much immediately because of the big results that happen, and we get a better picture of what's doing well. So let's jump straight into it. Starting off on the 15th of Feb, the Oceania International Championships. Obviously, I was commentating this tournament. It was 338 players who made the trek, and it was DDG's own Isaiah Williams who took the win with straight Zapdos. Essentially, literally just a combination of 4 Jirachi, a bunch of Zapdos, Coco, and then just a bunch of switching cards, like more than we'd ever seen. Like, I think it played like 3 board, 3 switch, 2 rope, 4 Guzma, and then like Volkners as well. So it had a huge amount of switching cards, and it was just saying that Zapdos pressure plus Stellar Wishing as much as you can is good enough, and that turned out to be the case. Daniel Altavia proving that as well by having a top 8 placement with the same 60 card list. So the pure Zapdos was kind of a little bit greedy, obviously kind of punished by Muck, but as you'll see, the second place list, Stefan Ivanov, again, making a finals of an internationals is another amazing feat for him as a player. His Zoroark Lucario list was full of innovation. Even just putting Lucario into the deck alongside Lycanroc was already innovative to have extra fighting support to help out against Mirror and Pikaroms. But also he had other decisions in his deck, like having Viridian Forest added into Zoro, which was something that, you know, I never personally foresaw coming at all. And it made a lot of sense just so you like have survivability against Let Loose and you have extra like discard synergies for your lilies and stuff. So really, really innovative list from him to make second place. But potentially the reason he only made second, I say in air quotes, second's a huge, amazing performance, was because he only played Ditto Muck and no Grimer. Instead, he played Absol. And going forward, pretty much everyone from this format, after seeing that straight Zapdos do so well and really being shown the power of Stellar Wish, pretty much every Zoroark player at that point onwards went to a Grimer plus Ditto combination and go towards Lily builds rather than Elm builds so that they could try and use a combination of Nest Balls and Pokecoms to develop the double threat of Ditto Grimer so that even if your opponent has a Guzma, you can still develop Muck on turn 2. That's the dream. So although Ivanov brought us this amazing Lucario creation, pretty much everyone just said, we got to have a Grimer in here from now on. So that's a pretty interesting thing to see. A Zoroark Rock also made top 8. This is the combination of the new and old Lycanrocs, the Twilight Eyes coming into the deck, and just having a thick Lycanroc line in general, having like 3 Rockruffs and then a 2-1 split. Twilight Eyes helping you like remove energies against some more awkward matchups, especially if you can't take knockouts, and then you have obviously Accelerock and Splinter Shards, both options to help you deal with Pikarom, in addition to the regular Claw Slash plus Bloodthirsty Eyes plus what's it called, Dangerous Rogue kind of package that you had going on in there. So that was a nice placement for that deck. Pikarom got 3 spots in top 8. I think at least one of them was Turbo Rom, and I think a couple of them were kind of like Jirachi hybrids that also had like a couple Zapdos. So it was pretty cool to see Pikarom do so well. Obviously it was like the most hyped deck, and it did end up being as good as expected. Getting 3 spots in top 8 already was so crazy as a breakout performance for the deck. Zap Beasts also was in top 8, so not the same as the DDG's kind of like straight Zapdos, although it kind of meant that there was another, like there was 3 Zapdos and 3 Pikarom in the top 8 basically. So yeah, that Zap Beast deck, definitely an interesting one. With Burt having all the Rainbow Energies, the Beast Energy, the Nihiligo, the Buzzwole, and also having Zeb Striker added into the list. That's kind of like the breakout for Zap Beasts. Obviously, we saw that a little bit from Japan. I think the list that we saw from Japan did play the Buzzwole and Nihiligo, but also played like the split of the Zeb Strikers. I remember it having like the new team up Zeb Striker that could actually attack, having like a similar a similar attack to Lucario's Aura Sphere, but for 2 energies. That just pretty much transpired that you just cut that and just play the Ultra Beast in basics and just have Sprint as an extra option to help you out against Muck, and also to help you just dig deeper into your deck to find these combo pieces. Robin Schultz also made top 16 with that same 60, so sort of reinforcing the fact that Zap Beast was very strong. And, you know, when a world champion's playing that deck, you always sort of take note a little bit more than any random person playing the deck, because you would expect a world champion to know a thing or two about the game and test a good amount, and obviously Robin is one of those players that does, so kind of put Zap Beasts on the radar as much as the straight Zapdos. We saw Ultra Malamar for all of its hype, and seriously, it was played a lot in Oceania. I would say maybe like 20% of the day 1 field was Ultra Mally. That's actually being generous, I would say. And it got as high as 9th. Didn't quite make the top 8, unfortunately. Carl Peters also making top 16 with a pretty interesting innovation on Zapdos, adding in the Lycanroc. So you have good fighting type coverage as well as having extra gust options. That's the first sort of sighting of a Lycanroc build. And Zach Lesage hanging on in there with Blounds. I think he was one of the very few people still playing Blacephalon in the room in Oceania. I think you could count them on one hand, the amount of Blounds players there were in day 1. But Zach proving why it's still strong. Making a top 32 placement with the deck is pretty impressive. Also, that same weekend, there was the Korean League Season 2, and they were playing the same format. Ultra Mally actually took 2 top spots, 1st and 2nd. Zapdos builds came 3rd and 4th. Both of them were adding in Jolteon lines. I think one was just Lightning that played Jolteon, and then one was Beasts that did play Jolteon as well. 3 Pikaroms made top 8, so that's both tournaments this weekend had 3 Pikaroms in top 8. And there was also a really interesting Tapu Koko Baby Buzz list that also was in top 8 of this league tournament, but that was like pretty much never replicated since. I think that came in the form of like Passimian Koko. Never really like a Baby Buzz Koko did well outside of this event, but a nice little thing to note. So we fast forward to the 23rd of Feb, Collinsville Regionals. This is just like a week after the internet, so obviously there's that sort of knee-jerk reaction of what decks did well and then sort of transferring that over. And the over 1,000 player tournament was won by Zach Lesage once again. Still playing Blacephalon after his top 32 placement. He said, it's still good to go, and we get that Alolan Muck into the deck, and you can improve your Zapdos matchup that are so reliant on Jirachis. And let me tell you, like the DDG list was very reliant on Stellar Wish. They had no backup. They just had a Rangaroo and Jirachis, and they didn't play a necessarily high support count either. They had a number of Kukuis in their list. So if you are able to use Alolan Muck, they can really, really struggle to get rolling and get their combo pieces. And 180 hit points actually becomes difficult for Zapdos players at that point. So the very Stellar Wish reliant build of Zapdos got very punished in Collinsville by the Muck addition in Blounds, which is part of the reason why Zach did so well, I would imagine. Because you sort of flip that matchup from very bad to maybe okay. Obviously, Zapdos, as that progressed through the format, they went more towards Zap Beasts and added in Zebras, and then the matchup once again becomes favourable for Zapdos. But for this weekend specifically, in a reaction to the AUIC, the Blounds plus Muck would have been an awkward matchup for them, I imagine. Zoroark, again, having to settle for second. Daniel Altavia, after making top 8 in the IC, now makes a second place at Regionals. Once again, DGG take down a Regional. It should be mentioned, their team has been incredible this season. Very consistent among all of the players. Valplume Stall made its first appearance in top 4. And there was also a couple Pikaroms, once again, making top 8, but no further in the event. And also there was a cool Buzzcario list, kind of an anti-meta type deck, trying to capitalize on the amount of Zoro as well as the amount of Pikarom there are, and just taking advantage of that Jirachi engine as opposed to previous Buzz lists that have relied on like Alolan Ninetales or even like Magcargo Guru. Now it's sort of taken the shape of Jirachi instead. That made top 8, as did Ultra Mally as well. So not quite being picked at the post this time, it made it into that top 8. The only other real stories from Collinsville was that there was a few other mills lower down, some other Varplumes, as well as a couple of Sylveons as well that made top 32. So something to bear in mind. There was the sort of murmurs of mill coming around. Obviously, Sylveon being able to capitalize on Zoroark matchups, as well as sort of straight Zapdos that doesn't really have enough raw damage output to get through a bunch of max potions and a bunch of energy removal cards as well, because they only play like 8 or 9 basic lightnings and then they can just get run out. So that's the first kind of murmurs of Sylveon doing okay. Obviously, it kind of gets stamped out by Pikarom, and that's the reason why we don't see a huge amount of Sylveon do much better than this weekend. During that weekend, that same date to the 23rd of Feb, was the Cannes special event. I was actually in attendance of this tournament, and I played Zapdos Beasts to top 64. But the tournament was actually won by Gustavo Wada, and he made the trek all the way to France to play Pikarom, and he's the first person of this team-up format to actually take a win with the deck outside of a bunch of top 8 finishes. Gustavo went all the way with it, which is amazing. Cremascoli got second with Hooper Regigigas. So again, after those murmurs of it doing pretty well in Collinsville, then Alessandro comes in and gets a big second place finish with it. There's 4 Zapdos in the top 8 of this tournament. So Cannes really was a Zapdos, nice field for them, really, I would say. There was 2 Zapdos Beast builds, including one of them with Adam Hawkins, who actually played the same 59 cards as me. He played a third Ultra Ball over a second Volkner. And pretty much his list was the one that sort of ended up becoming the most popular Zapdos Beast list, I would say. So I'd like to say that I was one of the originators of the double Zebra Zapdos Beast. So I'm glad that I sort of made my stamp on this format, even if it is just a small stamp. I'm glad that I was pretty much having the correct decision-making process around having double sprint in these Zapdos Beasts to really improve your Zoro matchup. And just anecdotally, in all the Zapdos, I've played Zapdos Beast basically throughout the Sun and Moon to team up format, and I never lost a series against Zoro with the double Zebra line, so that's pretty awesome. That was in tournament play. Obviously in testing and stuff I had, but in tournament play I'd never lost to Zoro, which was really awesome. Zap Jolteon also doing well as a Zapdos Lucario Buzzwole list that played Viridian Forest. So again, that sort of split of having basic fightings and basic lightnings, also adding in one beast ring that you can Volkner for on the key turn, so you can make that baby Buzzwole so annoying. Obviously, a lot of the Zoroark players moving towards Viridian themselves, because they were going based off of Evenoff's list, meant that the 130 hit point Baby Buzz was a huge pain in the neck for them, as was a big Aura Strike from Lucario. So pretty nice innovation from Zapdos TCG himself with the Zapdos Lucario build. Also, there was a placement for Zoroark Weavile by my teammate Stephen Mao, and Blacephalon also was in top 8 after doing well that same weekend, which is pretty awesome to see. It was the weekend before, right? Fabian Puyol and Hadrian Ehrman, they also had their own stories to tell, with Passimian Coco making 2 top 32 placements. These were some interesting lists. They weren't only just playing DCEs and counter energies, they also had some basic lightnings, as well as 1 or 2 Zapdos and some basic and a Tapu Koko Prism Star. So it gave them some other attacking presence, and that's pretty interesting from the SPE there. We skip to the 16th of March for the Chile SPE, and guess what? Gustavo Wada's good at playing Pikarom. He's able to take another win with the deck, so he pretty much makes that standpoint very early in the season and just learns Pikarom inside and out and continues to take down events, which is super impressive from him. Obviously he's been an insane player, and he's been playing for ages. I think he's a junior world champion and stuff. So, he's been amazing at this game for a long time, but the consistency that he has is just unparalleled, really, with Pikarom especially. Blacephalon got second place as well as a top 8, and 3 Zapdos and 2 Zoros round out the top 8. So it's kind of at this sort of not really midway points, but we've had a good amount of SPEs and regionals at this point, as well as the IC, and it seems to be just out the gate that Zoro, Zapdos, and Pikarom are basically top cutting every one of these tournaments. Those are definitely the top 3 decks on people's radars. Blacephalon is having some good results. Ultramally is kind of not quite there, but in and around it'll have a result here and there, as does the stalling decks. They're kind of the top 6 decks, if you will, with every now and then a bit of a wild card adaptation in there. But those are pretty much there's the big top 3 of Zapdos, Zoro, and Pikarom, and then there's the second 3, which is Mill, Blounds, and Mali, I would say. Those are really the main decks in the format at this point. We move on to Bolzano, another SPE in Europe. Only 126 players. I know just anecdotally that it was actually quite difficult geographically to get to the location Bolzano. It's not like the easiest place to fly to or travel to, even for driving. Pretty awkward area of Italy to try and get to, so that's why you don't see huge attendance for this tournament. But Pedro was able to win with Zapdos Jolteon, the same list, or well, at least the same archetype that he took to a top 4 finish with at Cannes, so pretty impressive consistency from him with that same deck. Speaking of which, Alessandro on his home turf also gets second once again, has to settle for second twice now at the 2 SPE events of this season, which is so crazy. There was 2 top 4 finishes for Zapdos Beasts, so continuing its prevalence. And I think a lot at this point it feels like everyone has gone away from the internationals winning like just pure Zapdos to Zapdos Beasts. That just seems to be the way people play Zapdos at this point. Here and there you'll see some Jolteon, here and there you'll see some Lucario or Lycanroc or whatever, but it feels like Zapdos Beast is by far the most popular build at this point. There was also 3 Zoros and a Blounds in top 8. 2 of the Zoros were Rock Carios and 1 was just the split of Lycanrocs. So that's pretty interesting to note again. Zoro Rock Cario didn't make too many changes, and neither did Zoro Rock Rock. They were pretty set in stone what the list kind of looked like. People would play around with like stadium counts and maybe a few things here and there, but usually it was pretty much set in stone. Like a good 58 or so cards of the list was all the same for those decks, as is Blacephalon. So you can just see that these decks were kind of getting their lists set up at this point. Zapdos Beasts rarely changed from like 58 cards. Neither did Zoro Rock Cario, neither did Zoro Rock Rock, neither did Blounds. All these decks were kind of like set in stone. It was only really Pikarom that was still figuring itself out at this point, I would say. Like, there were some big results from especially Gustavo, but there were still people playing Turbo Rom. There were still people playing, like 3 or 4 Zapdos and like 1 or 2 Pikaroms. There were still people playing like 4 Pikaroms and just going Judge Whistle and all that stuff. So it felt like Zapdos and Zoro and Blounds, they were all figured out in terms of 60 card lists. And it was just Pikarom that was still sort of like sluggish and getting towards that point where everyone was happy with a 60 by the sounds of things. Also that weekend there was the Fortaleza Regionals, and reinforcing that fact that Zoro Rock was doing very well. William Azevedo coming in with a win with that archetype. Funnily enough, he did have a few different innovations to his own build. He had Plumeria added into his deck. I actually think a handful of Brazilians added that Plumeria into their build. I think it goes in addition to the Twilight Eyes, so you can like take a Pikarom back a couple stages on a certain turn, something like that, to buy you time. And also for like mirror matches, obviously Plumeria is pretty strong, so that you can like use Lycanroc against them, and then you're not worried about them getting a big response on you, which is pretty cool. There was a small resurgence of Zapdos Lycanroc. It got second, and as always, 2 Zapdos, 2 Pikarom, and 2 Zoroark Cario were also in the top 8, and 2 of those Zoros were in top 4, so essentially 3 of the top 4 decks were all Zoroark Lycanroc builds, so definitely something to bear in mind. That Zoro was still really strong. I think really the only differences at this point was that it all played Muck and Grimer in addition to like Ditto. They were all Lily Nespal builds. It's pretty much the only real changes there. We go to the 6th of April now with Denver Regionals, 640 players, and DGG back at it. Caleb this time with a Zoroark control deck that was able to take down the win. This list was really, really crazy to look at. It played double Muck, it played 3 bodybuilding dumbbells, and even played Lavender Town and Champions Festival in the deck. So really trying to make your Zoros bulky, guarantee yourself that Muck, so you just shut down Stellar Wish from both Pikaroms and Zapdos, and a lot of fringe stuff as well. So they can't do anything, they can't get through 250 hit point Zoros, and you're just going to start removing their energy cards and removing cards from their deck and just getting into that resource management loop where they just don't have enough fuel to get through you. And that was pretty much the strategy of the Zoro control, and it did very well, of course, which is insane. Redigious Hooper got second as well as a top 8, so it definitely felt like control was the right play for Denver. Celosaur makes an appearance in at top 4, which is incredible to see. Big innovations from that list was it had heavy mixed herb and went away from the Gardenia lists that we'd seen a lot and incorporated Bill's analysis. because, you know, you can use that build to try and dig out mixed herbs to effectively have the same use as a Gardenia, but also helps you at digging out ball search cards and all this other draw cards, even like getting things like Adventure Bag out of your deck, with some pretty cool innovations from the Celebi and Venusaur. Very, very strong list that was pretty much taken from then on after a big placement. Mahone brings us the awesome Pika Pads variant that, again, you know, this is what I kind of mean. There was still all these different variations of Pikarom roaming around. Mahone even bringing the brand new, like, order pad list to the table with a top 8 placement, as well as seeing, you know, the Jirachi build still succeeding and the Turbo build still succeeding. It kind of just tells you how strong Pikarom is in a vacuum, that all these, you know, suboptimal lists are still doing very, very well. So you can't blame people's results being good just because Pikarom's that good. And then it's like, if you're winning with a deck, how do you sort of argue against it being the right way to play it? So you can see why people were having the struggle of what's the best list to take, because there was all these conflicting results of everyone's doing well, but with all sorts of different 60s, which is really cool to see, even this late into the metagame. Zapdos Jolteon and Zapdos Rock also had top 8 finishes, sort of reinforcing them as powerful archetypes. A couple stories later down the list, Ross Cawthon with a top 16 for Nagaquag, and he really brought about the dawn of a very new way to play Nagaquag with heavy Wishful Baton, really thick Quagsire, and just attacking with him, man. Just using his 120 hit points to be really annoying for Zapdos players, using some fighting tech Pokemon like Onix to be strong against Zoro and against Pikarom, and having that big Magikarp and Werelord to, again, like get you back ahead in the prize race if people are not careful with their bench. So very innovative list from Cawthorn that pretty much paved the way for Quagnag to make a small resurgence. Also, Alex Kreckler got 18th place with Beast Box. I think a number of other prominent players, Alex Shemansky's one that comes to mind, who also piloted this deck. I think they got points with it as well. So this is like an anti-meta deck, literally just trying to, again, have that tanky kind of aspect with Acerolas and Max Potions, using stack attackers to give you reduction of damage as you get hit, and just trying to use Buzzwole versus stuff that's weak to fighting, namely the Zoros and the Pikaroms, and just use Naga, a 1 energy card that you can like Max Potion a bunch off of when you're playing the Zapdos. So trying to target like 3 key matchups, and that's it. So the anti-meta deck getting 18th place there. So now we're in preparation for the EUIC. So I thought it'd be a good time to sort of gauge what people's reactions are about the best decks in format at this point in the game. So as you can see, I once again did a nice community poll. I'm really glad I do these. They're not only good at the time, but they're always good to have a little reflection of what people think the best decks in the format are. So before the EUIC, it looks like, again, people still thinking Pikarom's the strongest. That's the same picture that we saw at the pre-Oceania. Pikarom was the deck to beat. It was the top performing deck that people still believed was number 1. Zapdos, mainly Jolteon, was the hyped list. A lot of it was being touted just because it was good in Zapdos mirror matches. You can see Zapdos Ultra Beast being less popular down here. But it looks like Blounds was on a lot of people's radars, as was Zoro Rock. Blounds' position was an interesting one. It was kind of like a counter to Zoro Rock a lot of the time, as well as having Mup in there to help out against the Zapdos. So it kind of took like a bad Pikarom, but then like a 50-50 Zap, and then like a good Zoro, as well as having like the nice new Celisaur matchup that had recently popped up in popularity. That's why you can see it being actually like heavily voted for, because that new list came out and a lot of people are thinking about it. Some murmurs of Beast Box and Quagnag, as they have a couple placements down here. So yeah, that's kind of where the community's at. As you take a look at my top 10, I'm still a big believer of Zapdos. I still thought it was the best, the most consistent deck overall. Pikachu and Zekrom is a combo deck. That's kind of why I put it in at second. But obviously still powerful and has some insane results behind it. And it was really, the main reason I didn't have Pikarom first was just because I didn't know the right list. I didn't know, like, we've seen, like, as I keep mentioning, so many conflicting results. There's the Jirachi build, there's the Pads build that's just come out, which is based on basically coin flips to win games. And then there's the, like, heavy acrobike, Judge Whistle, like, let loose kind of build. So there was so much conflicting data with Pika Rom, I just couldn't really put my finger on it. All I knew that it was really, really strong. That's all I knew about it. Zoroark variant still in the top 3, and then that same picture that I mentioned earlier, the Hooper, Mali, and Blounds were like, after this top 3 is all very debatable where you put them, then it's like these 3 are all very debatable where you put those. And then there was like a few other like anti-meta style decks. Quagnag is obviously one that's close to my heart, so I had to rate it pretty high. Celosaur with that new adaptation, making it a bit more consistent, making it, again, quite an appealing one. Psimian Coco was one of these decks that hasn't really had many performances, but one that, in theory, is still very solid against some of the decks that you're trying to expect. When the top 3 is so strong, having good matchups against all 3 of them is just so appealing. And I had personal experience with Psimian Coco at a few cups and whatnot, and I felt I had the toolkit to try and beat all 3 of these decks relatively consistently. It's just like this second section down here where you're a bit less consistent. Like, your Malamar was kind of fine, your Blounds was kind of fine, your Redigus was horrible, and then, like, you don't want to see the likes of Celosaur and Quagnag. So it was great at the top 3, but then the fringe stuff you would still be bad against. And actually, Psimian Coco wasn't all that strong against Pika Rom. Like, it had to tech in Larvitar to have a good Pika Rom, which is pretty embarrassing for Psimian to actually have to do that. But yeah, the fighting deck still got trumped by the Pika Rom most of the time, just because either they would just like go for a tag bolt, knock out 2 Psimian and let loose you or something like that, and then you're like, oh, I've lost. So it had to tech in stuff, which is pretty crazy. Beastbox sort of coming out of the woodwork with that top 2 placement, I guess it was, and a few prominent players really backing it, made me think it was pretty strong. And again, similar to the Psimian Coco, it's just that theory of if you face enough of the top 3 decks, you're going to have a good day. That's pretty much the idea of Beastbox, even though it's not all that strong in a vacuum. So let's see how the European Internationals panned out. Once again, I was behind the desk, very happy to be a part of the tournament. And it was essentially a Pika Rom massacre. It was in the finals. Both players, Gustavo Wada and Filip Lechevsky, they both made it all the way with their Pika Rom builds. Gustavo, just king of consistency with this deck. He just knows how to play it perfectly, and he was able to take gold with the deck. And Philip's list was crazy, man. He played like heavy Mysterious Treasure, which gave him insane outs to Lele on 1, also Let Loose on 1. It even gave him that Oricorio option to dig out extra lightning energies, which is really cool to see. And again, it's one of these archetypes of Pika Rom. As I keep going back to this story that no one knew how to build it correctly, well, everyone had a different opinion on how to build it correctly, I guess is the right term. And we're seeing it succeed in all sorts of different variations. Zoroark got top 4, as well as 2 top 8 placements. And Zapdos Beast made it all the way to top 4 as well. Should mention, to round out the top 8, there was also Philip Schultz, who made top 8 with Pika Rom also. So 3 Pika Roms in the top 8, 2 of them in the finals, as well as the Zapdos and 3 Zoroark. So again, painting that picture, turns out the 3 best decks that we all hyped were indeed the 3 best decks. And yeah, pretty much everyone had the right idea at that point of 800 player tournaments. If you're just bringing the best stuff, you've got the best chance to do well. However, there were some slightly lower placing decks that also caught my eye. Kaiwin Kababe had the record to make top 8, but actually bubbled. And he was playing a spreading Coco list that had 3 Electro Chargers in addition to 4 Electro Powers. So really just trying to sprint and cycle your deck and make the most out of your flying flips as much as possible. I believe it also played like the Coco GX package. Stuff like that really sort of came into effect. I think the biggest thing about Pika Rom doing really well at the EUIC was that a lot of them incorporated Wobbuffet. Wobbuffet shut down Ditto, so effectively protected you against Muck a little bit, against the Zoro stuff, and most importantly, it shut down other people's Coco Prism Stars. Kind of the big issue of going all in with Pika Rom was that so many decks could punish you with their own Tapu Koko, essentially in Mirror and against Zapdos, which is 2 of the top 3 decks. You could just lose sometimes to you going all in with Full Blitz. So the incorporation of Wobbuffet into the top performing Pika Roms was definitely palpable and noticeable for their success. However, back to these sort of lower placing decks, Mike DeGode with a top 16 placement this time of Beastbox, again, kind of like reinforcing that as a threat in the meta. I actually got to speak to him about his like day 1 and day 2, and he faced a good portion of the top 3 decks, so strong meta call from him. Simon Humphrey with that Quagnag deck. We got to see him on stream. I think he was winning in at one point. I think it was against Philip Schultz. So he got very close with Quagnag, which would have been insane to see. Again, one of those decks that was just a few tweaks from Ross Cawthorn's initial 60. Jitmin won our hearts on stream with a Detective Pikachu Tapu Koko deck as well, which was awesome to get to commentate over. And also Pedro Torres decided to be a clown for the event and played the Shedinja Zebstrika Exodia deck. And yeah, this is a deck that I'm sure is a lot... It's like even more on people's radars now that we've seen some Unbroken Bonds results with a similar adaptation with a few new techs from Unbroken Bonds. So the sort of birth of this very awesome Exodia deck started here with Pedro and a few other European players piloting it to day 2. I think there was 3 in day 2, maybe even 4. So yeah, the deck was real. Just sprint your deck away and then resource management back the cards you need and make sure that you can loop Shedinjas. It's a very difficult deck to play around, especially if it's like brand new. So I think surprise factor also came into play here, where Shedinja was just so difficult for people to play around because they didn't realize that if they Ultra Ball away a Guzma at any point in the game, they lost themselves the game. Like later down the line, they just run out of resources to get through a chain of Shedinjas, which is crazy to think. So really, really innovative deck. And the fact that Pedro was taking this to an internationals when, you know, he's a very serious player. He's had some huge results. It shows you that he had the confidence in something wacky to do very well. And he ended up getting top 64, which is a huge heap of points. And he got to have fun throughout the entire weekend with a pretty wacky list and getting a lot of reactions, I'm sure. So after the EUIC, everyone's kind of getting bored of this format, I would imagine. I personally was. I was at Bristol. I played a variation of Zapdos. I played Zapdos Lucario that also had Absol, Baby Buzz, and I even played a Raikou in my list. So it was a pretty strange adaptation of Zapdos Lucario. I had the record for top 64, but I bubbled points, and I was pretty unfortunate on the day. I faced 2 Celosaurs, I faced a Beast Box and a Quagnag, so 4 of my 9 rounds were like fringe decks, and I beat every other top tier deck. So I think I made a good meta call, and like I thought my list was pretty busted for the format. It's just I faced some bad stuff. So let's see how the tournament ended up. It was actually finally Alessandro making it to the win, and after 2 finals and having the disappointment of losing in some specials, he's able to win with Stool in a regionals. So he's been on absolute fire with this deck, and people got to take note about Millman. I mean, seriously, it did insane. And also Sander, another dedicated denial kind of player. He'll hate me for calling it Mill or Stool. He also made top 4 with the deck. He didn't play Unknown Hand. Alessandro did. Alessandro faced him in top 4 and was able to win. So Alessandro's tech card, which was useless for the entire day, came up trumps when he had to face Sander in top 4, which is amazing. And it was what led him to that victory eventually. Also, we saw Zap Beast. It got second place with Nico Alabas, as well as 2 top 8s, including Andre Scubal, who was at the top 4 of the EUIC, which is insane. And don't forget, the other person who made top 8 with Zapdos Beasts was our very own Jackhold from OmniPoke. Shout out to him. And yeah, for his performance. I think his list was very similar to Andre's. I think the only change he made was going down to 1 escape board to play 3rd escape rope. That was really just because we expected a lot of Absol. Essentially, that's about it. So yeah, shout out to Zap Beasts. It was my favorite deck throughout the entire Team Up expansion, and I've played Zapdos variants basically the whole time, outside of maybe a few cups where I played some other wacky stuff just to try stuff out. Ultra Mally also ended up with a top 4 placement as well as a top 8, and Zoroark, a top 4 as well as a Zoroark that made top 8. So yeah, Bristol was actually a really weird tournament. As I mentioned, I faced a Beast Box, 2 Celosaur, and a Quagnag, and it felt like maybe 35% of the tournament was just wacky decks, man. And that's kind of reflected by the 3 Celosaurs that did make day 2. They all ended up right at the bottom of the pile in day 2, which is pretty interesting, seeing as though, you know, they had good enough records to make day 2 in the first place. But it feels like the archetype wasn't able to stand up on its own when facing, you know, necessarily players who were able to play around it a little bit better, and just the archetypes that ended up making it to day 2. Probably there were some players who got shafted on day 1, like myself, who could have made it to day 2 with decks, but just hit too many Celosaurs. So I think Celosaur definitely had its biggest showing of maybe any tournament in this format at Bristol. And that was a huge headache for me. So yeah, cheers Celosaur for ruining my day. Finally, we have the 11th of May, the Malaysia Regionals, and it was won by Zapdos Lycanroc. This was the archetype that started way back on the top 16 of Oceania, had some placements here and there, was never really the most popular Zapdos build, but it had its breakout victory right at the end, Brent Tonneson getting the win there, and it also had another top 8 spot. Zapdos Jolteon got second and a top 4, so again, Zapdos coming out trumps, just like it did in Bristol, really. In terms of taking up the actual top 8 spaces. Ultra Mally made top 4, and a Zoroark Vile, and a Pika Rom closed out the top 8 for over a 316 player tournament. So that's pretty much, again, just a good spectrum of decks, and it really did solidify that sort of idea that there were 3 top performing decks overall. You can see for individual deck, Zapdos was the one that claimed the most points. This doesn't really paint the full picture. I think this combines Zapdos Shrine, like regular Jirachi, the DDG list, as well as the Zapdos Beasts. So it's kind of a falsehood here where it could have been split down a little bit further. But yeah, Zapdos was overall the most profitable deck in this format. Pikarom and, the Jirachi Zapdos Pikarom as well as the Turbo Pikarom coming in at 2nd and 3rd. Zoroark in at 4th, and then we start seeing some other Zapdos builds. Some other Zoro builds, as well as Ultra Malamar in there at 6th, and Blounds, as well as Regigigas Hooper and Zapdos. So even when you see the top 10 archetypes, they're all renditions of that top 6, basically, where it's Blounds, Reggie, Mally, and then it's a combination of Zapdos, Zoro, and Pikarom. So realistically, it's a top 6, and then everything else sort of drops off at that point. You can see points-wise, there's like the very top ones, and then there's, after the Zapdos, it's a big drop-off down to some lower tier decks. The Celosaur, the Coco, Vikaray was one that actually made no top 8 placements at all, but was just continued to get played for a number of points. Zoro Control having that big breakout, a big win for them, and then sort of like never, just kind of went back into the binder. Once that trick's played, like everyone sort of puts their gurus into other Zoro decks and stuff like that, and life gets more difficult for Zoro Control. But it had its big win, which is awesome. And then when you look at overall like archetypes, not splitting them all up, again, it's the same story. Zapdos, Pikarom, Zoro, kind of, I know that it's kind of like Zapdos getting double than Zoro, but I would say still after that, they're the definite top 3. Then it kind of drops down in terms of overall point earnings to this middle 3 section of Mally, Blounds, and Walls, and then it drops off even further to these other decks that, are considerations and had some decent showings here and there, but never at the same consistency level as all this other stuff. So that is going to round out my little discussion through Team Up. I thought it was a really interesting format. I did really love playing Zapdos. That was the archetype that I played as much as possible, and still like playing it at the moment, to be honest, in Unbroken Bonds. I still think it's got a lot of merits to it. It's got a new little toolkit at its disposal with some new Ultra Beasts and whatnot, so looking at Unbroken Bonds to kick things off, like Charizard's definitely the tag team to beat. Lucario Melmetal and Lieutenant Surge, as well as Pokegear, are some new tools for the stalling decks, which seem to be doing pretty well so far as well. And Zapdos is continuing to do well. Zoro's got all this sort of new water support and can add in Persian and triple acceleration energy. So the top decks that we're currently seeing are basically being joined by Reshizard, and Mill also gets a big buff as well. So I would say those are the cards to watch out for in Unbroken Bonds. Only time will tell though, and I'll be doing this once Unbroken Bonds is all done with. So yeah, hope you enjoyed, guys. A few tournaments to go. Good luck to you at the NAIC if you're attending. Not far away now, just like a month away. So gonna be cool. I'll be going back to Unbroken Bonds decks tomorrow. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you there.